Hi, I'm Sion Winship, architectural historian, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Today finds us back poolside in Palm Springs during Modernism Week 2025. This time, our guests are authors Chris Rawlins on Fire Island's Horace Gifford and Donald Luxton on Vancouver's Arthur Erickson. Finally, from the PRP4 DOCOMOMO conference in Boston, we'll talk with David Fixler. And now here's your host, the pragmatic Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. We modernist preservationists have the best intentions. We recognize that adaptive reuse maintains community continuity and reduces climate change. Most, but not all, the buildings we love can have 50 more years of useful life with a new purpose. As the guardians of old, somewhat charming, and dangerously out-of-code modernist buildings, we attend countless meetings. Most of them are incredibly boring. Yet despite all our heart and soul and effort, we can't understand why more people aren't on our side, joining and donating in greater numbers. Perhaps it's because some preservation groups protest so often that eventually people stop listening and caring. I'll say it. Not every modernist building is worth saving. And when a great one comes up, and the demo permit has been approved, and the bulldozer is heading down the street, that's not the time to mobilize. When a building goes vacant is the time to get started, and even better, a few years ahead. Too few preservationists bother to scout buildings likely to be in future trouble. We forget that shrill protest isn't as effective as having a coherent strategic plan. Protesting at city council about a building's rich history rarely wins zoning debates, and it doesn't help to treat developers as mustache-twirling villains. I marvel how some groups show up to protest at public hearings and never bother to even engage the developer in advance. When jobs, housing, or a decent neighborhood coffee shop or grocery is at stake, locals are going to favor teardowns. And city planners love density, not sentiment. Millennials and Gen Z, desperate for affordable housing, can hear preservation as, sorry, you're never going to own anything. So let's face it, developers have more money, more staff, and better lawyers, and they can afford to wait and delay until we've run out of time and energy. It's like driving around a rambunctious 4-year-old until he goes to sleep. We can do better. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Returning podcast guest Chris Rawlins is an architect, author, and preservationist based in New York. As the principal of Rawlins Design, he specializes in beach houses and mid-century modernist restorations, particularly at Fire Island. His book, Fire Island Modernist, Horace Gifford and the Architecture of Seduction, is out in a new expanded second edition. With a master's from Princeton,
Go Tigers!
And a BA from Georgia Tech,
Go Yellow Jackets!
Rawlins founded Pines Modern, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving Fire Island's architectural legacy. Here's our poolside conversation with Chris Rawlins.
Chris, you are back in Palm Springs to talk about the second edition of your book, updated, revised, improved, new photos, new houses, new everything.
That's right. I have been wanting to do this for years. The pandemic slowed it down, like a lot of things. The book, originally came out in 2013. Since that time, more information has come to light. A number of houses have been beautifully restored, so I wanted to add them to the mix. And, there's just a different climate around preservation now that I wanted to address in print.
What is that climate? Is it partly cloudy? What is it?
Well, I think the good news that's come out of the work that I and others have done is there is a genuine embrace of Horace Gifford's work and the work of his peers that were working on Fire Island. but that's come in the context of a superheated real estate market.
Yes.
And so it used to be rather sleepy, but now there's all this pressure to create sort of maximum rental space in some cases, which is somewhat at odds with these sort of diminutive houses made oftentimes just for a couple and a couple of guests. You know, that kind of is at odds with a rental formula that says you have to have giant bedrooms, each with an ensuite bathroom, and you end up with giant boxes hovering over these tiny lots. And so while there have been some great restorations, I think there's also been a certain gigantism at work. There's also been, and this predates the book and continues, a kind of continuing suburbanization trend. And what I mean by that is people fence in their properties. Fire Island was traditionally been a really public place
Very
to enjoy
open.
private architecture.
Like
and that sort of voyeuristic quality.
Home of the drop-in, right?
Yeah, it's home of the drop-in. That voyeuristic quality is really part of the magic of it. And so in my new introduction, I talk about how the good news is that we've embraced Horace Gifford's aesthetic. The bad news is that in many cases, we haven't embraced his sort of communitarian ethos.
Yeah. There's a little more stay the hell out kind of going on.
Yeah, there are these very beautiful but very aloof compounds that are taking shape out there. And so that's the part that's a little bit harder to contend with.
I guess one of the advantages of Fire Island over somewhere like the Hamptons is that the lots are so small that you can't have these monsters go up as frequently as you do. Is that right, or are they starting to come?
Well, you're correct in that. I think that the workaround has been that people are buying multiple lots in order to create those giants.
And so they're able to combine those lots.
Yes.
Oh, well, what are you going to do about that?
Well, currently there's nothing illegal about it. Some of what's going on, it's not just private houses. People are essentially building rental properties. Like everywhere else, there's sort of a housing crisis on Fire Island.
Right.
And part of it is this incredibly strict zoning that only allows for single-family homes. We have a harbor filled with 1- and 2-story buildings. Personally, and this is kind of controversial, I'd love to see 8-story buildings there so that young people can still come out there and get a hotel room.
Yeah.
But, you know, we have layers and layers of regulations. We're essentially living within a national park. So you can imagine that in that system of laws basically freezes in place what was there in 1964, even though our needs are very much larger than they were back then.
Because you'd want to expand, too, with normal infrastructure like doctors' offices and hardware stores.
And since the pandemic, we got Fios out there, fiber optic internet, just before the pandemic. So a lot of people are living there year-round now. And so that just sort of changes the whole ecosystem of needs and wants in a way that we haven't really addressed yet.
Well, let's go back in time. And Horace Gifford discovers Fire Island. When is this?
He shows up in 1961 and immediately falls in love with the place and buys a lot. And at the time, there was very little modern architecture in Fire Island Pines to speak of. There was a beautiful home just being built in 1961 by Andrew Geller. Mm-hmm. Andrew Geller, in that environment, had the misfortune of being heterosexual. So so Gifford came in and basically started seducing the clients that Andrew Geller, rightfully should have had for the taking. So Gifford was very much a true child of the 60s.
Yeah, and he had a particular marketing style that involved a swimsuit.
Well, his business attire consisted of an attaché case and a Speedo.
Yeah, which would have done very well. I've seen pictures of him, yeah.
Yeah, you could say he was, in his physicality, you could say he was almost built in a laboratory to succeed out
He looks
there.
sort of like Brando, I guess, James Dean sort of figure.
A bit, sort of broad-shouldered, pouty lips, blonde hair, rather muscular. He was an ardent swimmer, so he had that swimmer's kind of classic build.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah. And
like
his
a perfect
practice
storm.
just took off.
Yeah, absolutely. He sort of slept his way into the profession. Those clients really turned into patrons and commissioned multiple houses from him. And by 1964, there was a journal called American Home, and they published, I believe, 3 of his houses in the same Beach House issue, including the cover. And so it was just off to the races with him, and working with a very small staff, usually just 1 or 2 people at any given time. He was cranking out 10 or 11 houses a year in his prime.
How many houses has he got?
He built a total of 63 houses in Fire Island, 40 of them in the Pines. Now, when you consider that the Pines has only about 600 houses, that's a pretty significant mark.
Yeah.
So not only did he personally do a lot of the houses, the whole aesthetic that comes out of that is really coming from him.
Yeah, he's defining it.
And then he built another dozen or so in the Hamptons and a small handful. He did one in Texas, one in Florida, and some in Connecticut
Texas.
for his sister who
Okay.
lived there. Yeah.
And of course, we lost his colleague Harry Bates a year or two ago, which is very sad.
Yes.
Who also was doing homes at
And
Fire Island.
Harry was basically the second most prolific
Yeah.
architect, and he's the only one who sadly, survived the whole AIDS epidemic out there. And
How'd he look in a Speedo?
I didn't see him in a Speedo, but he was pretty darn dapper, I have
Yeah,
to say.
okay.
I brought him out and I borrowed basically a golf cart to get over all the boardwalks, and because he had no archive. And so I thought, how am I going to figure out what his houses are all about? So he came out and we traversed every boardwalk in the Pines, and he just pointed them out, and we were able to get inside some of them, and it was wonderful. And one nice thing that came out of it too, I wrote a letter to a homeowner with the original published article from 1971. I said, did you realize you live in a house by a famous architect? And he had no idea, so he invited me over for a drink, and we were talking about the house, and he says to me, so if you were going to renovate this house, what would you do? And as he likes to say, that was the most expensive question he ever asked because I did renovate the house, and it turned out wonderfully. He's a terrific client, and then it got published in Wallpaper magazine recently.
Was this one of the houses that Harry got featured in Sports Illustrated? I know he had a whole series in that.
No, this house was not in Sports Illustrated. It was in House Beautiful in 1971.
Okay. Now, between the first edition of the book and now, what have you discovered?
I think that the longer I stay on Fire Island, the more I become attuned to the aspects of it that are not just architectural. And there's some of that. The book is certainly a cultural history as much as it is an architectural history. But I personally am so much focused on the community aspect of Fire Island and Fire Island Pines specifically. And my friend Charles Renfro, the architect who's a partner at Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, wrote an amazing afterword. I think it's the most incredible addition to the book. And the title of it is called Productive Escapism. And he talks about Fire Island's essential quality as this kind of escape from New York, which offers us so many opportunities in terms of creativity and in terms of our livelihood and all of that. But it's just so vast that Fire Island offers this kind of a containable structure where we have this walkable, scalable life that gives us just so much pleasure.
Yeah.
And because New York is so vast, it's really hard to make a kind of coherent social life gel because everyone's so busy, they're so scattered, they're always traveling. But we come to Fire Island and we're just bumping into each other all day on these little boardwalks. And I think one thing that's really different about Fire Island is we share houses. Even when we're over 40 and making money, which usually at that point people aren't sharing much of anything.
Yeah.
And what I love about Fire Island is there is still that kind of tradition, which I think builds in a certain mental flexibility because you're still, sharing a kitchen with somebody, and also builds community. And so
It's like a small town.
it really is
in the middle of New York
It is
City.
absolutely like a small town, and so we get to have the satisfactions of living in a small town without the bigotry that made some of us flee from small towns in our childhood.
That too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's become this epicenter where there's such a sense of safety. I mean, it's like you see in Provincetown, I would suppose, as well.
Yes, and actually in my revised introduction, I talk about how I first visited Fire Island in 1998 on a day trip. And while the visuals from that are hazy, the memory that sticks with me is of holding my partner's hand walking down the boardwalk with a complete absence of fear. I had held my partner's hand in public before, but never without a slight sort of stiffness in my shoulders and always kind of waiting for something to happen.
Yeah.
And there's just a complete absence of that there. It's the safest place on earth.
Well, it certainly has developed into this wonderful, as you say, community of people supporting each other and keeping this architecture going. You're involved, as you said, in renovating some of these houses,
Yes.
improving them. What do you encounter most often when you go into a house? What's wrong with it most of the time? What is worn out first?
Well, these are coastal properties, so they take a beating. They're made of wood, and so a lot of times, they're not level. They're built on pilings, so the pilings rot, and then the house is sort of slanted. And also, over time, they accrete lots of mistakes over the years.
Yeah.
Most people, when they buy a house, they don't do a sort of completely master planned renovation. They decide to add a pool, and then the pool goes in willy-nilly, and then all that ugly pool equipment goes in willy-nilly. And so when I came across, for example, that house by Harry Bates, the house was still there. You could see the bones, but it was located in a virtual junkyard of pool filters and just rinky-dink things all over it. So it's really a process of stripping it back to what you had. And maybe you're not putting it back exactly as it was, but you're really getting back to that essence of what is it that makes this house so striking in terms of the volumetrics, in terms of the materiality, the colors, all of that. And the hard thing is, in terms of getting the work, I have to tell the clients it's going to cost twice as much as you think it does. And after you spend twice as much as you think you have to spend, you're going to have less house than when we started because you're overbuilt. So that's not really nice.
Yeah. And the reaction to that will tell you a lot about your client.
Absolutely. Well, the reaction about half of them is they show me the door.
Yeah.
The other half
Which
are
is probably
generally
the right
in
thing
it
to do.
for the long haul, and they've been wonderful to me.
I mean, I would figure that some of these accretions you were talking about are simply normal human cash flow issues. I have enough money to do a pool, but I don't have enough money to, really do it right or figure out where to hide the pool equipment, for instance.
Working out there has its challenges and has its expenses, but I don't have to tell you, hiring an architect ultimately can save you money because you're not duplicating efforts, and everything you do builds in a productive way on what came before. Even if you can only afford to do it piece by piece, if you've got it all planned out. And I work that way all the time. A lot of people, they only want to do work in the off-season. We're a very seasonal place. People are there from roughly April to October. And so I have multi-phased projects going on out there, but it's all drawn at once. It's all thought through at once.
So how does construction happen on Fire Island where there are no cars?
Very precariously, because it's all these sort of rolling 6-foot wide boardwalks. So that's why we have wooden construction. Everything is lightweight, and it's basically put onto electric carts that travel over the boardwalks.
So you've got to cart in all your cinder block and all your wood.
You have to bring it on a freight boat over to the island, then unload that freight boat onto these little metal carts. Cart by cart. And so it's a very slow and homemade way of going about things.
You must have some badass golf carts to haul all that stuff.
Oh, it's kind of amazing. And, they can somehow, I guess they string them together in some way, but they can put out a 25-foot high piece of glass on these things. It's kind of incredible.
No.
Do the owners of the houses have golf carts too, or is this some sort of transit system that the island organizes? How does it work?
No, only contractors and people who obtain like a special permit, like if you have a disability or something, can get a license to have a cart.
Okay.
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
So it's walkable for the
And
rest
we
of
have a community service that provides for elderly people in the community. They call it the Margie cart. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's actually what I used when Harry Bates came out. I borrowed the Margie cart for the afternoon, and we tooted around and found all the properties.
Can people stay on Fire Island? Are there hotels or Airbnbs, or how can they spend some time there?
There are a few hotels, but not many. And part of that just comes from, like I was talking about, the overlay of the zoning. It's mostly private houses with just a few hotels in the harbor. Some of the homes are basically run as Airbnbs.
Yeah.
Most people do it the old-fashioned way, though. They find a broker who finds them a house that they lease for a season or a month or a week.
Okay. Are there like grocery stores there? I mean, can you get everything right on the island, or you have to go off to get...
There is a fabulous grocery store, and it is a marvel of both selection and expense. But we love them, and we understand why it costs a lot, because they got to go through that same carting of everything out that the contractors do.
And how does Amazon come in? Can you get an Amazon delivery? Does it come on a golf cart? How does it come in?
Yeah, you basically.
Well, that's, they're starting to use drones.
I haven't seen drones yet, but we all travel there on a ferry, and you can get any kind of boxed item delivered on a ferry as well. I even got a prescription filled once where I phoned it in to the mainland pharmacy, and they just put it on the boat, and I had it the next afternoon.
I have a friend who lives on Chebeague Island off the coast of Maine, and they do let cars on there, but the ferry is not an auto ferry. You come there, and you have to make special arrangements to bring an automobile over there, like on a barge in the middle of the week. But when you're going to visit, a lot of times as they're loading passengers, you also see big cranes unloading building materials and packages. I mean, you see all of life get loaded and unloaded onto these ferries. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Are there any looming threats to the way of life on Fire Island and the horizon? Or is it pretty safe for now?
I think we absolutely have threats related to climate change. In 2019, we spent $1.7 billion to completely reconstruct the beach on Fire Island, which is about 30 miles long.
Yeah.
So you can understand why it would cost that much money. It was supposed to be a project that would shore us up for 20 years. It was all gone by last year, and the water was rushing under the oceanfront houses at high tide. So we have just done that again, and I don't even know what it costs this time. My concern is, how many more times is the government, especially in the current environment we're in, going to be willing to, rescue us that way?
Yeah.
It's an Army Corps of Engineers responsibility. And so that is this kind of thing that everyone feels much better right now, but given how short a time the old beach lasted, I think that is going to be a constant issue that we're going to have to contend with. And any kind of coastal community is facing some variation on this.
Is replacing the sand the only viable option, or is there some kind of seawall option as well?
I think seawalls are often counterproductive.
That's a little above my pay grade, but to my knowledge, the only thing that's been seriously considered is rebuilding the beach. And that's been going on in some form for decades.
Yeah. That's a lot of sand for 30 miles.
It is, but when they first complete it, it's incredible. I mean, it's football field size depth of beach.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And how do they get that stuff on the island?
The equipment, there's basically these huge ships.
They come from the ocean?
And they pump, they come from the ocean, and they pump the sand from a couple of miles out, and it's all brought in and kind of pumped in a kind of wet slurry, and then they just kind of rake it out and recreate the dunes and plant dune grass, and it's pretty incredible.
Okay.
Set decoration.
Yeah, well, what's $1 billion or $2 billion between friends?
That's right.
Chris, thanks so much for joining us again. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, I love it. I love your show, and thank you for having me again.
That was Chris Rawlins. A Vancouver native, Donald Luxton is a historian specializing on the legacy of renowned Canadian architect Arthur Erickson. Luxton is a graduate of the University of British Columbia.
Go Thunderbirds!
Where he's been recognized with numerous honors, including the Haig Brown Prize for the book Building the West. And he is active in preservation organizations all across Canada. From Palm Springs, here's George's conversation with Donald Luxton.
When you have a show like U.S. Modernist, you talk a lot about U.S. modernism. Today, we're heading to the north to talk about Canadian modernism with Donald Luxton. Hi, Donald.
Hello.
So you're an expert on a particular architect who is very well known in Canada, particularly Western Canada. Who is this?
Arthur Erickson.
Yes.
He was very well known in Canada. He was called, we know him as Canada's most famous architect, and he practiced in the period from about 1953 to 1990s, and then his career kind of fell apart in 92, but he continued to practice until he died in 2009. But he also had an international career, which a lot of people don't connect to Arthur Erickson, and has been somewhat forgotten these days. He had an office in Los Angeles and did a lot of work in California. He worked in the Middle East. He had an office in Toronto. He was internationally known, and so his reputation has kind of flown under the radar for a while, and we're trying to bring it back. I'm a board member of the Arthur Erickson Foundation, and we're working to promote his legacy.
How did Erickson get started?
He was born in Vancouver, wanted to be an artist, and he was inspired by seeing a magazine article on Taliesin West by Frank Lloyd Wright to pursue a career in architecture. Went to architecture school in Eastern Canada and had trouble fitting in at the time. He graduated in 1950. He was a confirmed modernist, and most of the firms in Vancouver where he was trying to get a job were really just not into this kind of newfangled architecture. So as he said, he got fired by every big firm in town. He ended up teaching architecture at the University of British Columbia and moonlighting, designing houses on the side, which was the start of his career.
And he's very well known in Canada for these houses. They're just really cherished.
They are. He was practicing on his own, sometimes working with an architect named Geoffrey Massey. They did a few houses here and there. Arthur didn't have a lot of clients. Jeff had his own firm. But they came to prominence in 1963 when they won the competition for BC's second university, Simon Fraser University. And it was completely unexpected. They didn't even have an office together when they won.
That's a big commission to get.
Massive. Everybody was just could not believe it that these two guys in their 30s who didn't even have an office won this massive competition with 71 entries, and their selection was unanimous.
And I assume this was a modernist design for the campus?
Very much so. And Erickson, 2 years previously, he had won a travel bursary to Japan, so he was very familiar with Japanese brutalist architecture, the architecture of Kenzo Tange and Kunio Meikawa. And he was inspired by their work, by their textured concrete, by their daring forms, and he brought that sensibility to the design of Simon Fraser.
As the university built these buildings and adopted them, did they warm up to them, or did they complain about them all the time?
There's a lot of complaints. Actually, the university had to be open in 18 months. And so they had to build it instantly. It's called the Instant University. So it was built very much to the Erickson Massey plans. There were other architects working under them. There were 5 separate construction sites going on all at the same time to pull together what is essentially one building. But it was delivered in time within 2 years from the call of the competition. So really remarkable. So that part of the campus is incredibly consistent, something you'd never see.
Have they preserved the buildings well over time?
Like all things institutional, there are maintenance issues and things that have changed. Overall, it's very much intact. And Simon Fraser and their master plan have adopted a cultural landscape approach that we hope will see really good conservation of the building moving into the future.
One of the common things I hear about buildings of that era, whether they're university buildings or banks or whatever else, is that they were just really wonky to heat and air condition, that you couldn't quite get the weather to be correct inside these things consistently. Why was that?
It's a challenge because of the building envelope, if nothing else. I mean, the mechanical systems also were not as efficient as they are today. But if you think of the way some of these buildings were built, the concrete is on the inside and the outside. It's the structure and the cladding. So it kind of transmits the weather through it. So when it's cold outside, it's cold inside. There's no kind of vapor barriers or insulation that can provide much of a barrier. And there's also single glazing. There's all kinds of things that were done at the time that we probably wouldn't build a building that way today. But the essential challenge of conservation is to keep things as they appeared. So we have to find very creative ways to preserve these buildings.
As a consultant to many, many organizations on heritage conservation and on preserving buildings, how do you make that call? I mean, how do you get a vapor barrier put in there somewhere or improve things when you're working on a building so that you try to eliminate some of these problems that have been around for 50 years?
There's many techniques, and it really depends on the type of construction. So we have to come to agreement with envelope consultants, engineers, architects. We have to have usually a team approach to attack a problem of this scale. But from our point of view, we're trying to follow our standards and guidelines that keep the appearance and the character and the value of those buildings. Technically, we get our best improvement in energy conservation and sustainability through the improvement of the mechanical systems. So sometimes we don't focus on the envelope as much as overall performance. And there are ways to do it. They get very technical, but there are things we can do.
And when he says envelope, what he's really talking about is the overall structure of the building.
Yeah, and the cladding.
Right.
Yeah.
What's covering the outside of the building.
Yes,
right.
Correct. Yeah.
This is not something you put a postage stamp on and
No,
mail it to your grandmother.
No.
Okay.
And envelope consultants don't go to Staples either.
That'd be good. They can press that easy button.
Yeah, that's right.
You've mentioned in your discussions about Erickson that he was misclassified as a brutalist.
Absolutely. The first big commission that him and Jeff Massey did, Simon Fraser, was built out of concrete. There was no way to build something that quickly in any other material. So concrete was easy and cheapest and didn't require any extra work other than just finishing the concrete. And Erickson labored over those concrete finishes. He was really inspired by that Japanese brutalist work he'd seen. And so there's bush hammering and pickaxing and sandblasting and board forming and all kinds. It's just a beautiful example of concrete work. But I consider SFU his only real brutalist-inspired work. And after that, we see a refinement in his use of concrete that is really quite extraordinary. So it's hard to call it brutal when it's so elegant and carefully detailed and framed. And Arthur didn't really conform to a style. He was very much inspired by each individual site and how it informed the design. And so he designed in concrete, wood, steel. There's many things, different ways that he expressed those buildings. So to call him a brutalist, I just don't think is accurate. He's kind of started there, but went way beyond it.
I know there were a lot of World Expos and other kinds of big events taking place in Vancouver over the years. Was he ever part of those?
Absolutely. SFU really launched Erickson Massey into sort of architectural superstardom, and they became very famous, not just in Canada, but were very recognized internationally, both for the university and for the houses they were doing, like Smith 2 and some of the other really just classic buildings that they were pumping out. They were just published and won awards to an extent that was quite extraordinary. So they, of course, ended up being asked by the Canadian government to do some architecture for the Japanese International Trade Fair in 1965, one of the theme pavilions for Expo 67, and most spectacularly, the Osaka 70 Expo, the Canadian Pavilion, which was considered the best building at the fair.
And that's gone now, right? They tore it down after the fair?
Yeah, these are all meant to be temporary buildings, so none of them exist except in photos.
Yeah, that's too bad. You know, it's unfortunate that we're no longer involved in World's Fairs very much as a nation.
Yeah.
Because that used to be our calling card about sharing American culture with the rest of the world.
And other cultures sharing as well and coming together internationally. And it was always such a big part of the international landscape for a long time.
What happened to Erickson in 92?
So there's a number of very complicated things that happened with his career. Him and Jeff Massey split up by 1972, but Arthur, he was the creative guy in the pair, and Jeff was very steady, solid backup for him. But Arthur was one that was always traveling internationally. He never married, never had kids, so Jeff was at home raising his family, and Arthur was flying around the world. And so he was developing his international contacts, and that's when he started picking up work around the world. So he opened offices specifically in Toronto to start with, and then Los Angeles and in the Middle East. So he had a lot of things going on in his life. He had apartments in Rome and New York as well. So he was living the international jet set lifestyle. And he was extremely successful for quite a long period of time. In California, he designed a number of community colleges. He designed the master plan for Bunker Hill and California Plaza 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. He was very well known in Los Angeles society and knew a lot of A-list movie stars. So he was flying pretty high. But a number of things caught up to him. Number one, the Middle East projects, almost nothing got built, and they lost millions, literally millions of dollars due to regime changes and different problems with the projects. So there was this little thing when Saddam Hussein took power in Iraq that all the Baghdad work was just canceled and never paid for.
Okay.
These are leaving great gaping holes in the cash flow. And then the market changed in 91, 92. The office market died. There was a lot of cutbacks in public health and in the educational sectors, and the work dried up. All of a sudden, there was a lot of money going out and no money coming in, and it led to a very spectacular bankruptcy, which Arthur declared in 1992.
Okay.
And really just collapsed the whole structure that he had built. He continued to work. He went to work the next day after he declared bankruptcy. He found things to do, and people brought him in as a consultant straight through into his 80s. One of the great triumphs of that late career was the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, Washington.
I've seen photos of that. It's very nice.
It's quite spectacular. Yeah.
Have you written a book on Erickson?
I have not. Other people have.
Okay.
I'm actually very interested in Arthur from an architectural historian point of view. I knew Arthur, I knew his work, and he was very generous in his later years to work with us to document a number of his projects. So a lot of our documentation is out there in terms of statements of significance and conservation plans and reports. Arthur was just very generous in sharing his creativity and his thought process. And so that's been my main interest, is kind of following what inspired him, what brought him to design these buildings. And it's a fascinating and creative process he had.
Where did all his archives end up?
They're split, but they are very well organized in Calgary in the Canadian Architectural Archives and in Montreal in the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and there's other material in UBC special collections as well.
Has anyone done a documentary on Erickson yet?
There's a couple of films that are floating around. Of course,
Okay.
Arthur was born in 1924, so it's been his centennial year we've been celebrating.
Yes.
It's running through till June 2025. There's a film called Beauty Between the Lines, which focuses more on his personal life. And there's a documentary on a long-lost, rediscovered house now in Edmonton called The Dyed House. So there's starting to be some really good documentaries. There's a lot of material on Arthur. He had a very, very active, internationally famous career for 30 years.
Yeah.
But he's been kind of forgotten for almost 30 years. So it's really been time to talk about him and interview people and begin to really look at the legacy again. And of course, I'm looking at it more from a heritage point of view now, like preservation and how do we continue the legacy.
Well, I have certainly been fascinated in learning about Arthur Erickson. Thank you so much for stopping by and saying hello.
My pleasure indeed.
George was speaking with Canadian author Donald Luxton. David Fixler is an expert in the adaptive reuse of modern buildings with a special focus on 20th century modernism. A graduate of Columbia,
Go Lions!
he began his practice in 1980 and worked on landmark projects like Alvar Aalto's Baker House, Eero Saarinen's Kresge Auditorium and Chapel, and Louis Kahn's Richards Labs. He advises institutions including Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and the UN, and since 2017 has led his own firm. David lectures worldwide, publishes widely, and serves in leadership roles with DOCOMOMO and the Society of Architectural Historians. George caught up with him at the recent Preserving the Recent Past DOCOMOMO conference in Boston.
David, I want to know what was in the mind of this guy about architecture.
Actually,
I'm showing a picture of him in high school.
That guy knew he loved architecture in the sense of loving to look at buildings.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point in my life, I never really imagined I would be an architect. And it took me going through, well, first of all, I had the very good fortune to travel for a year in Europe with my family, mostly with my half with my family, half by me, right after high school, between high school and college.
Yeah.
Then I really got a taste for architecture. So I began to think about this. But I was very academically bent, and I figured, okay, maybe I'll do architectural history. And I realized by the time I graduated from college that I would never be able to live with myself if I were to study architecture and not be an architect.
Yeah.
So I worked a couple of years that had some wonderful experiences between college and graduate school, and then went off to graduate school, and by 1980 graduated and became an architect.
So did you just go into your own practice right away, or did you
No.
work for other firms?
My first job was very interesting. I worked for a firm called Cooper Eckstut. Cooper Eckstut were one of the only firms in New York that were really thriving in the late 1970s. We worked on big urban design master plan projects like Battery Park City,
Yeah.
and the Times Square redevelopment.
Oh, yeah.
These are major efforts. And I mean, at that point in my life, I really just wanted to work on buildings. But in retrospect, this was very good experience for me, which has really paid off. It's paid off in my teaching. It's paid off in the way that I look at cities. It's paid off in many ways. And then after that, I went through and worked for a couple of corporate firms for decades before going off on my own about 7 years ago.
Okay. And how is it being your own boss now?
Oh, I like it. Frankly, it's not as remunerative as working for a big corporate office, but I can set my hours, I can set what I do, and I do have the joy of teaching. So I'm able to do a course a semester. I've got a contract such that it's not just being paid for the individual course. I'm an employee.
Oh, that's great.
And it's been great. It's been a good experience. I don't know how much longer it'll go on, but that's okay. I'm getting on myself, so.
What are you teaching? What courses are you teaching?
My main course is called Building Conservation and Renewal.
Okay.
And basically, I am the voice of historic preservation to the GSD students who don't have it.
This is at Harvard, right?
This is at Harvard, and they do not have a program. They used to have a program called Critical and Strategic Conservation, which was highly theoretical. Mine blends some theory with a lot of practical knowledge and a lot of case studies. You do a lot of work with case studies, just showing people how you deal with existing resources, because there's a lot of demand for that. The students want to work on existing buildings because more and more there's an environmental imperative that we just heard about this morning, and we've probably heard about a dozen times in this conference about the necessity for saving buildings from a carbon capture viewpoint, if nothing else.
Right, for an environmental reason.
For environmental reasons, right.
You've been doing this a long time, and I've read a lot of architecture magazines that are in our collection. It seems like when preservation really started kind of in earnest and got on the public scene in the 60s and 70s, it was about saving significant buildings.
That's right.
And now the conversation seems to have shifted to representing the communities behind the buildings. The women, the minorities, the original landowners, things like that. That is a big piece of the conservation
That is a big
movement.
piece of it. And that's to be applauded, because one of the slides I show early on to my students is a picture of Philip Johnson with Mayor Koch and Bess Meyerson and Jackie Kennedy on the street in New York protesting the demolition of Penn Station. And I say, that's very nice that they're doing it. This is an elitist enterprise. You can't get any more elite than these
those
people.
four people.
That's
yeah.
right. So it is changed. But the other thing that's happening is, because of the environmental prerogatives, a lot of buildings that aren't iconic, what I call the sub-iconic buildings, are getting more attention. Ordinary everyday modernism, is OEM, we often call it.
I like that.
And it's apartment complexes, it's commercial space, it's lesser quality institutional buildings, but buildings that are solid, durable. And here, this is what my students like. They get a creative opportunity to do something with them.
so that you're not necessarily preserving them to the Secretary of the Interior standards, but you are hanging on to the bulk of the fabric, even if you are changing its identity in some way.
I've noticed that in our state, North Carolina, that a number of really marvelous modernist buildings from the late 50s and 60s got repurposed in the 90s and then kind of went awry. They just started doing things like insurance buildings turned into police stations. We've had a couple of those.
Wow.
And of course, the police who move in hate those buildings because they weren't designed for them at all. And then they have to get out, and now the buildings is in jeopardy. How do you see the use of these buildings fitting in so they can last longer?
Well, it's always useful. I mean, this is where being a good design professional comes in. It's always good to sort of look analytically at what the building is and do test fits of different types, so that you should, I guess what I'm trying to say is that owners should be given reality checks about what they want to do with a building. You know, too often an architect will get hired and they're happy to get the job and they figure out, we'll figure out a way to do this. But if there's a fundamental disconnect between what they want to put in and what they have, I mean, it may not be politic to say anything, but I think that is the responsibility to some degree of people to at least make them aware. You're trying to put a square peg in a round hole here.
So how do you tell the emperor that you can't have an orthopedic clinic in this building?
I don't know. That becomes a difficult problem. You can obviously refuse the commission, but then you don't get anything. But the best thing to do from an owner's standpoint, and here's where the onus falls on the owner, is before they buy a building, and if they have an idea of what they want to do with it, they should test it out. They should do a feasibility study and say, is this the highest and best use of this building? Does it work? Or even if it's not highest and best, does it work at all? And I think the examples you gave me are interesting, especially for a police station. It's hard to imagine, although I have to applaud somebody for at least trying to think outside the box, saying, what can we do with this building?
Yes.
What's a need that we have?
I'm hoping that now it's going to be turned into some sort of residential use.
Oh.
It's one of these buildings with floor-to-ceiling glass windows, terrazzo floors. I mean, the whole complement of mid-century modernist features. Walnut and mahogany everywhere.
And they wanted to make this into a police station?
They did make it into a police station for several decades. It's under review right now. It's owned by the city of Durham.
Well, if it worked for several decades, and I have no idea how successful it was, but the mere fact that it lasted several decades is testimony that somebody must have done something right.
Well, they cut it up. They chopped it up into little tiny pieces.
Yeah. And in that sense, I see what you're saying, which is that there was an essential character about this, which has been lost because of that improper use.
Yeah.
And that again is something that one hopefully takes care of in a feasibility phase of a work before an owner has made a commitment to do one thing or another, or even to buy the property.
Is that common for owners to be that forward-thinking about a property when they're considering buying it?
I think increasingly it is. I mean, I don't deal much with commercial real estate. My experience has primarily been with institutional buildings and with the sort of urban scale stuff. I mean, I've had experience working with developers. They actually a good developer does a lot of work up front before they make final commitments.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. You were involved, I guess now, 25 years ago or so, in the renovation of Baker House at MIT with Alvar Aalto's.
A little more than 25 years ago. We actually began that project in the spring of 1996 with a feasibility. Now, of course, MIT already owned the building. They had it. And that was a transformative experience for me. I mean, obviously, it was a very important building, but it gave me a chance to test out some of my ideas and to put some things down on paper. I did a book. I did a number of articles. There was a lot published on that. And I've done that really with all my projects except the United Nations, where you just can't publish things. But Baker House is an extraordinary building. I mean, I always liked Aalto as an architect, but now I think somebody asked me the other day, recently, like yesterday, who's your favorite architect? That wasn't you, was it?
That wasn't me.
No, it wasn't you. Okay. And I said Alvar Aalto. Oh, I know who it was. It was Kelvin Dickinson.
Past podcast guest.
Of course, he wanted me to say Paul Rudolph.
Right, of course, yes.
I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Aalto is a very special architect. Aalto is an architect who is really about building experiences and process in the best way, and thinking about, as you move through one of Aalto's space, his anticipation of what you need psychologically and where you want to go, what your hand wants to feel, how it wants to be guided. And the attention he gave to these kinds of things make his work unique. I don't think there's anybody who's ever been quite that sensitive with this kind of stuff. Now, I made some decisions and some moves on Baker House, which some traditional preservationists disagree with, and I understand why. But I stand by them, most of them. Some of them, I think, I got a little carried away, but they're on easy things like light fixtures. I mean, this is, if you want, you can always replace a light fixture.
Sure.
But there were things we needed to do with the building to meet accessibility and insurance requirements. And I made a decision to sort of extend the aesthetic and not try to introduce something foreign. I mean, typically what you're supposed to do is make your changes clearly apparent from what had been there before. And we tried all kinds of ways to do that. And in the end, we wanted to be a little bit more in the idea of extension rather than difference.
So I didn't know that was kind of a rule, that you want to make your changes readily apparent.
Oh, yes. That's part of the Secretary of the Interior standards.
Okay.
Is that it should be very clear to anybody looking at your work that there's an original and there's an overlay. Sometimes it's really hard to do that and not really muck up a space.
Yeah, I would think so.
And that was the problem we had at Baker House because of the nature of what needed to be done. But there's another aspect of this, George, and here again, you need to be very careful. We did a lot of research. We had the original drawings. And we had the testimony of the people who worked with Aalto, his Finnish assistants who were still alive at the time. And we interviewed them. And what I wanted to do in the dining room was to raise the height of the knee wall in order to get it to meet code, rather than infilling it with mesh or glass or something like that.
Right.
Well, we found out from the drawings and the testimony of these gentlemen that that's exactly what Aalto wanted to do. Now, one has to tread very lightly and cautiously into the realm of speculation, saying, if I put myself in Aalto's shoes or Kahn's shoes, this is what he would have done. You don't want to do that. But we had A, program necessity, and B, evidence that this was a design that was changed. As a matter of fact, the assistant who had been on site when that decision was made said it still bothered him 50 years later.
Oh, wow. So that was a pretty straightforward change.
Yeah, and we changed the ceiling. So these are both details which, if you didn't know what you were looking for, it kind of runs together. So be it. I mean, now it's part of the building. And like any of these things, you could reverse it, but I don't think it will be, because it works. I mean, I think it actually works quite well.
Let me ask you about modernist buildings that have been torn down. And there are two schools of thought about what happens next.
Yeah.
One is, it's dead, you leave it alone, not coming back. Mm-hmm. Second is, why not build a replica of it and preserve what was there before? How do you see that falling out?
I think it really depends on the circumstance. I think in most circumstances, it's a done deal, it's dead, it's over, move on.
Yeah.
There may be rare occasions, especially if the way in which the building came down was somehow scandalous or wrong. I mean, whatever it might be. So there may be cause to do that kind of thing. I mean, like they did with Mises' Barcelona Pavilion. That's the classic example. And I think the world is glad they did that. But that's a building that only went up for a year as a temporary structure. I mean, I'm glad they did it because it's great to experience it, even if we're not sure if it's exactly what Mies designed.
Yes.
But I'd say generally, I would be more conservative and say generally let sleeping dogs lie.
Okay. Last question. You're working primarily with architects and architectural historians and preservationists and people who are professionals in their fields. What about the people who are just residents of a community who want to take some kind of preservation action, what is your recommendations to them when they want to try to save a house or a building in their neighborhood? What should they do as people who are not in this day in, day out?
They should express their concern, clearly articulate why they think the building is special, and try to learn as much about it as they can so that the owner or the advocate for tearing it down can't come back to them and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And anybody can do that. I mean, any literate person. I mean, most of this stuff is not rocket science. And the more you learn about something, the better story you can tell, the more persuasive you're going to be to whoever it is that you're sort of up against. But you also have to warn people that they're going to lose sometimes, and
right.
You can't win everything. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try.
I don't have a scientific count of the number of times this has happened, but it seems like by and large, neighborhood preservation efforts tend to lose. Just the developer waits them out, and eventually it gets approved by some local municipal body, and then people are just wringing their hands that they lost this. So I'm wondering how these neighborhoods can be more effective in evening up that score.
We're dealing with that now in a very important modern house neighborhood in Lexington, nearby here. Given the way property rights are cherished in this country, it's very difficult to... if somebody really wants to tear something down, ultimately it's very difficult to stop them unless the building has been landmarked or there's some other protection that's given it. A lot of it is just moral suasion, and we've had luck with that in the town that I live in. We saved a very early modern house, like one of the first in this part of the world. Predates the Gropius house by years.
Which one was that?
That was the Field House in Weston, Massachusetts, 1933.
Okay.
The architect was a guy named Ned Goodell, who you've probably never heard of.
I haven't.
And he did another house next door, which is a little later, which Gary Wolfe did a beautiful restoration of. We mounted a big effort, and this is now over 20 years ago, to shame basically the person who bought this house into saving it and selling it rather than tearing it down. Enough people in the town made it clear that they didn't like this idea, and if you want to be on good terms with your neighbors, don't start this way.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, David, it's been a real pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much for spending some time with me here.
You're very welcome, George. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Malibu, Los Angeles, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, I think it's time for dinner.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 25,000 significant modernist houses, and access 5 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Enterprising is her middle name, or it could be Esther. We really don't know. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back next week and in 2 weeks with more guests from Palm Springs.